In the year 55, your arms are hanging limp at your...
What if I told you that 1969 had a completely different soundtrack than the one history gave it credit for?
I sit down in Louisiana, where the alligator grows so mean.
Everyone remembers Woodstock. Everyone remembers the moon landing. Everyone remembers the cultural earthquakes that defined that year in the history books.
I'm leaving on a jet plane. I don't know when
But underneath all of that, on the radio, in the cars, in the living rooms of ordinary people living ordinary lives, there was a whole other layer of music. Songs that hit #1.
Build me up, buttercup, don't break my heart.
Dominated the airwaves for weeks, and then quietly disappeared along with the artists who made them. Not because they were bad. Some of them were extraordinary, but because the moment they belonged to passed, and the machine moved on without them. Today we're going through 15 one-hit wonders that only people who actually lived through 1969 truly remember. The stories behind these songs are stranger, sadder, and more fascinating than you'd expect. Let's get into it. 15. Crimson and Clover. Here's something that changes how you hear this song. Tommy James recorded Crimson and Clover in an almost hallucinatory state.
Crimson and clover.
Deliberately pushing the production into territory that nobody at the label quite understood. The tremolo effect on the vocals, that warbling, hypnotic quality that makes the song feel like it's dissolving at the edges that wasn't an accident. He wanted it to sound like nothing else on the radio, and it didn't. It hit #1 and stayed there, selling over 5 million copies in the United States alone. But here's the pattern. Tommy James had been making music for years before this, and would continue afterward, but nothing landed with quite this combination of strangeness and commercial appeal again. The song existed in its own frequency. You couldn't manufacture that twice, no matter how hard you tried. 14. Dizzy. Tommy Roe had been around long enough to know how the industry worked. He'd had hits before, understood the formula, knew what radio wanted, and then he made Dizzy.
I'm so dizzy, my head is spinning.
Which somehow managed to feel both completely calculated and genuinely irresistible at the same time. The production was light, almost silly, built around a melody so simple it seemed impossible that nobody had written it before. It hit #1 in both the United States and the United Kingdom, which for a song that lightweight was a remarkable achievement. But that lightness was also the trap. Roe couldn't go heavier without losing what made Dizzy work. And he couldn't stay this light without sounding like he was repeating himself. The song defined him so completely that everything after it existed in its shadow. Some hits are so perfect themselves that they leave no room for anything else. 13. Aquarius, Let the Sunshine In. This came from a Broadway musical that most of the people buying the single had never seen. Hair had opened on Broadway in 1968, and the Fifth Dimension took 2 of its songs, stitched them together into a single medley, and somehow turned a theatrical piece about counterculture into the #1 song in America. It stayed at the top for 6 weeks. What's fascinating is the gap between the song's origin and its audience. The people singing along in their cars weren't necessarily buying into the counterculture politics behind it. They just responded to the feeling, that opening melody, that sense of something opening up and expanding. The Fifth Dimension had other moments, but nothing that captured that particular feeling again. Some songs arrive at exactly the right cultural second. Move them a year in either direction, and they disappear entirely. 12. In the Ghetto. By 1969, Elvis was in trouble. The movies had exhausted his credibility. The hits had dried up, and the cultural conversation had moved somewhere he wasn't. And then he walked into American Sound Studio in Memphis and recorded this.
A little boy with the runny nose plays in the street as a cold wind blows in the ghetto.
Mac Davis wrote it as a direct, unflinching portrait of poverty and cycles of violence, and Elvis delivered it with a restraint and sincerity that nobody had heard from him in years. The industry was shocked. Critics who had written him off completely had to reconsider. It became a top 3 hit on both sides of the Atlantic and announced that Elvis was still capable of something real. In the Ghetto wasn't a one-hit wonder. In the traditional sense, Elvis was never that. But for the version of Elvis it represented, the serious, stripped-back artist, it was a moment that never quite returned. 11. Suspicious Minds. 2 Elvis entries in the same year tells you everything about where he was in 1969. He was rebuilding in real time, recording with an urgency that hadn't been present in years, and Suspicious Minds was the result of that energy hitting its absolute peak.
We can go on together with suspicious minds.
It became his first #1 in the United States since 1962, 7 years without a chart topper, and then this. The production was enormous, the vocal performance was everything he had, and the song itself was built on a kind of emotional trap that everyone understood immediately. 2 people who love each other, stuck in something neither of them can escape. Elvis understood that feeling. You can hear it. He never had another US #1 after this, but as final chart toppers go, there are very few that come close to matching what this song actually delivered. 10. Honky Tonk Women. The Rolling Stones released this as a standalone single in the summer of 1969, and the timing of everything surrounding it made it one of the most loaded releases in rock history.
Give it the honky tonk blues.
Brian Jones had just died. The band was transitioning into something harder and more dangerous. And this song arrived like a statement of intent, loose, swaggering, built around a cowbell intro that announced itself before a single word was sung. It hit #1 in both the United States and the United Kingdom simultaneously. But what makes this a fascinating entry is that it existed slightly outside the album cycle, a moment between eras, a bridge between the band they had been and the band they were becoming. The Stones obviously had a long career ahead of them, but this particular version of them, raw, transitional, and completely unguarded, only existed for a moment. 9. Get Back. The Beatles recorded this during the most documented and most miserable sessions in their history. The Let It Be sessions were supposed to be a return to simplicity, but what they actually became was a public record of a band dissolving in real time. Get Back was the single that came out of that chaos. Recorded on a rooftop in London in what turned out to be their last live performance as a band. It hit #1 in both the US and UK. And here's the thing, as a one-hit wonder entry, it fits in a very specific way. It was the last Beatles single to top the charts while the band still existed. Everything that came after was aftermath. Get Back is the sound of something extraordinary ending, even if nobody in the moment fully understood that's what they were hearing. 8. Sugar, Sugar. Here is a song that topped the charts in 1969 and was performed by a band that did not exist. The Archies were a cartoon. The voices were session singers assembled in a studio, the product of a deliberate commercial calculation by producer Jeff Barry to create the perfect bubblegum pop single.
Oh, honey. Oh, sugar, sugar.
And it worked almost disturbingly well. Sugar Sugar was the #1 song of the entire year on the Billboard charts, beating out everything the real bands released in 1969. Every actual musician who lost chart position to a cartoon that year had to sit with that. The song has no interesting backstory of struggle or artistic vision. It was engineered to be liked, and it was liked more than almost anything else that year. Sometimes the most honest thing about pop music is how straightforwardly it operates. 7. Everyday People. Sly Stone was building something in 1969
that the music industry didn't have a category for.
A band that was racially integrated, mixed gender, blending rock and soul and funk in ways that crossed every demographic line the industry relied on to sell records. Everyday People was the clearest expression of that vision, simple, direct, and carrying a message about equality that landed without being preachy about it. It hit #1 and stayed there for 4 weeks. What makes this a fascinating one-hit wonder entry isn't that Sly disappeared, he had other hits. It's that this particular version of his message, this specific combination of simplicity and sincerity, never came through quite this cleanly again. The later work got darker and more complicated. Everyday People was the moment before all of that, the last truly uncomplicated thing he made. 6. Build Me Up, Buttercup. The Foundations were a British band that almost nobody remembers, and yet this song has never left. It shows up in films, commercials, and playlists with a regularity that has nothing to do with the band's profile and everything to do with the song itself. Written by Tony McCauley and Mike Dabo, it was handed to the band rather than grown from within, which tells you something about how the industry operated at the time. The Foundations delivered it perfectly, the energy, the desperation in the verses, that chorus that refuses to be ignored. It hit the top 5 in the United States and number 2 in the UK. But the band couldn't sustain momentum, and within a few years, they had dissolved entirely. The song outlived the group by decades and will probably outlive most things. Some songs are simply bigger than the people who recorded them. 5. Leaving on a Jet Plane. John Denver wrote this song in 1966, sitting on the floor of an airport, waiting for a flight. He recorded a version himself that went largely unnoticed, and then Peter, Paul, and Mary recorded it in 1969 and took it to number 1.
'Cause I'm leaving on a jet plane. I don't know.
Giving Denver his first major commercial success as a songwriter.
I'm leaving on a jet plane. Don't know.
Before anyone knew him as a performer. What's interesting is how the song functions emotionally. It's a simple goodbye, but it carries an openness and uncertainty about whether the person leaving is coming back that touched something universal. Peter, Paul, and Mary had been making music throughout the 60s, but this was their only number 1 single. And for Denver, it was the beginning of something much larger. 2 careers defined by a single song. One it ended, one it started. 4. Polk Salad Annie. Tony Joe White wrote this song from direct experience of poverty, the swamp.
To the world. Made the alligator look tame. Polk salad Annie.
The specific texture of rural Southern life that he grew up inside. Polk Salad Annie wasn't a character he invented. She was a composite of people he actually knew, and that specificity is exactly what makes the song so vivid. It crept into the top 10 almost on atmosphere alone, that guitar tone, that drawl, the unhurried confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was describing. It became a cult favorite fast enough that Elvis Presley recorded his own version, which introduced White's writing to an enormous new audience. But White himself never repeated that commercial moment. He kept recording, kept touring, and built a devoted following. The mainstream just never came back the way it had in 1969. Some artists are too specific for repeated mass consumption. 3. Galveston. Glenn Campbell recorded this Jimmy Webb composition in early 1969, and what came out was something genuinely unusual for the pop charts.
Galveston, oh Galveston, will I still...
A Vietnam-era song told from the perspective of a soldier thinking about home without being explicitly political about it. Webb wrote it as a meditation on longing and distance, and Campbell delivered it with a vocal performance that made the emotion feel completely unguarded. It hit number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100 and crossed over into the country simultaneously. The timing was everything. 1969 was a year when the country was exhausted by the war and desperate for something that acknowledged that exhaustion without taking a political side. Galveston did exactly that. Campbell had other hits, but this particular combination of song, singer, and cultural moment, that specific intersection only happened once and couldn't be engineered again. 2. In the year 2525, 2 guys from Nebraska recorded this song in a small studio with almost no resources and released it independently. It sat dormant for a year before a larger label picked it up, and then it hit number 1 in the United States and stayed there for 6 weeks.
35, ain't gonna need to tell the truth.
In the UK, it did the same thing. A dystopian vision of humanity's future, stretching thousands of years forward, delivered with complete sincerity by 2 people nobody had ever heard of. The song connected because 1969 was a year when that kind of anxiety felt completely rational. The war, the assassinations, the sense that civilization was accelerating towards something nobody could control. Zager and Evans never charted again. They became the definition of a one-hit wonder. But for 6 weeks in the summer of 1969, two unknown guys from Nebraska had the whole world listening to the end of everything. 1. Spinning Wheel. Blood, Sweat, and Tears arrived in 1969 with a sound that had no obvious precedent. Rock and jazz and brass and orchestration all occupying the same space simultaneously.
Spinning wheel, got to go round, talking about you.
Spinning Wheel was the clearest expression of that ambition, a song that moved through multiple moods and tempos like it was making a point about what popular music was capable of. It hit the top 5 and won the Grammy for Record of the Year, and yet the band's commercial peak was remarkably brief. They had a run of hits in 1969 that suggested a long, dominant career ahead, and then the momentum simply stopped. The cultural moment that had made their particular combination of sophistication and rock energy feel exciting passed, and what had seemed like the future suddenly felt like a style. Some bands arrive perfectly timed for a moment that turns out to be shorter than anyone expected. 1969 had a whole other soundtrack that history mostly forgot. These songs prove it. Some of them deserved far more than they got. If you enjoyed this one, hit subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.